The mission had been planned for months. Humanity had finally been given a chance to send one of its most trusted diplomats to a distant world, far beyond the systems where humans had first ventured. For years, Earth had been trying to build trust with other civilizations. The diplomat chosen for this task had been someone who carried both wisdom and calmness, a person who could stand in front of strangers from different species and still make them feel respected. People admired him for the way he spoke, clear, respectful, and with a rare kind of warmth. When the day of departure came, the entire planet watched the launch. It wasn't just another political trip. For ordinary families, students, and workers, it felt like history in the making. They saw it as a step toward proving that humans weren't only survivors or fighters, but also peacemakers who could bridge differences. Even though space was filled with uncertainty, people believed this mission would bring hope. The journey took weeks, but news updates kept flowing back home. The diplomat was welcomed politely by the host civilization, one that humanity had always viewed with a mix of admiration and nervousness. Their culture was older, their ships larger, and their influence stretched across more star systems than Earth could count. For them to invite a human envoy was a gesture that many believed could change humanity's standing forever. When the first images of the diplomat standing alongside alien leaders were broadcast back to Earth, people clapped in living rooms, cheered in cafes, and even lit up city squares with bright displays. Children pointed at the screens, whispering about how one day they too might walk among the stars. For a brief moment, Earth felt united. There were no divisions of nation, race, or class. Everyone felt like they belonged to one world, one people, watching one of their own carry their voice into the unknown. But fate is cruel sometimes. Just when hope seemed brightest, tragedy arrived in silence. It was supposed to be a ceremonial event, attended by officials and civilians alike. The diplomat, dressed in the formal attire that represented Earth, walked onto the stage with calm confidence. His smile, as always, carried reassurance. People back on Earth were watching the broadcast with pride, believing they were witnessing the start of something new. Then chaos broke the air. A sudden movement, a figure emerging from the crowd, and in the blink of an eye everything changed. The diplomat fell, and before anyone could make sense of what had happened, his life was gone. The live broadcast cut off almost immediately, but not fast enough. Millions had already seen it. Families watching together gasped in horror. Some cried, some shouted in disbelief. Others simply sat frozen, unable to process what they had witnessed. On Earth, silence took over. Cities that had been celebrating just hours earlier turned into places of mourning. The streets that were filled with flags and music now carried only whispers of grief. People looked up at the night sky, realizing that the very stars they had once dreamed of now felt distant and cruel. In the corridors of government, the news spread like wildfire. Leaders who had once been proud of sending the diplomat now sat with their heads in their hands. Advisors scrambled, intelligence officers demanded details, and military officials quietly prepared scenarios. No one could yet say who was responsible, but suspicions grew instantly. Across the galaxy, the story spread faster than light. To many alien civilizations, this was not just news, it was a warning. They knew humanity's reputation. Humans were known as tough survivors, a species that had risen from a dangerous world filled with challenges. To kill a human diplomat, especially one sent in peace, was like striking a spark near dry grass. Most expected fire to follow. Some alien governments began withdrawing their representatives from Earth, fearful of being caught in the storm they believed was coming. Others whispered that perhaps this was the moment humans would reveal their true nature, not the friendly open faces they showed in diplomacy, but the warriors that history spoke of. There were even those who quietly began preparing their defenses, afraid that fleets of human warships would soon take flight in revenge. But inside homes on Earth, far away from politics, the grief was personal. People who had never met the diplomat still felt like they had lost someone close. He had spoken for them, carried their hopes, and died in front of their eyes. In classrooms, teachers struggled to explain to children why someone who carried no weapon, someone who only carried words of peace, had been killed. Many cried openly, while others demanded answers. Rumors spread across social channels, some claiming it was a planned attack, others suggesting betrayal, and some even insisting it was a misunderstanding. But no matter the theory, the truth remained. The diplomat was gone, and his mission of peace had ended in blood. The silence from Earth's government only deepened the tension. They released no threats, no declarations of war, only a short message confirming the death and asking for time. Yet this quietness did not ease fears. To other civilizations, silence from humans was more frightening than anger. Anger could be predicted, but silence left room for imagination. And imagination in times of fear often turns dark. Still, among ordinary people, something different stirred. They were devastated, yes, but they were also united. Strangers comforted each other in the streets. Families who had lost nothing personally still lit candles at night in memory of the diplomat. The sense of shared grief was so strong that it crossed borders and cultures. For the first time in generations, humanity felt like a single family again, standing together under one grief and one loss. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. Would their leaders strike back? Would ships be sent to the stars in anger? Or would something else, something no one expected, rise from the ashes of this tragedy? The galaxy held its breath, waiting for humanity to move, and humanity for the moment stood silent, wounded but not yet broken. The news of the diplomat's death had reached every corner of the galaxy. Within hours, messages, broadcasts, and discussions filled the channels between worlds. In some places there was shock. In others there was fear. And in many places there was quiet expectation, awaiting for what humanity would do next. Aliens across star systems knew humans carried a long reputation. They had studied Earth's history, its wars, its revolutions, and its endless record of struggle. To them, humans were survivors born on a harsh world forged by challenges and dangers. Other species called their own planets gentle, calm, and nurturing. But Earth was often described as a death world, a place where storms, earthquakes, predators, and sickness had always tested life. The galaxy remembered this fact whenever they thought about humans. They saw them as strong, adaptable, but also dangerous. So when the diplomat was killed, many believed humanity's reaction would follow an old pattern. A wound like this could not go unanswered, they thought. The natural conclusion was war. On one alien homeworld, a council gathered in secrecy. The members argued late into the night, their voices rising and falling with worry. One of them slammed a hand against the table, saying that they had to prepare their fleets. The humans will not stay quiet, he warned. Another disagreed, saying that humans had grown wiser since joining galactic society, that perhaps they had changed. But even as they argued, they began quietly moving ships into position, not wanting to be caught unprepared. On another distant world, shopkeepers and families whispered to one another. They remembered stories from past encounters with humans, how quickly they adapted in battle, how fiercely they defended each other. If they strike back, one elderly alien told his grandchildren, entire systems may burn. His voice carried not hatred, but fear. Back on Earth, however, the picture was very different. The streets were not filled with armies or fleets, but with grieving people. Vigils spread across cities and towns. On walls and screens, the diplomat's face appeared everywhere. On news channels, on banners, on posters made by children who barely understood what had happened. People gathered in squares and lit candles that glowed through the night. The silence of the crowd said more than any speech could. Foreign observers watching through hidden cameras and satellites reported what they saw. They expected mobs demanding war, soldiers marching through streets, and governments announcing swift retaliation. Instead, they saw tears, flowers, and quiet songs. This confused them even more. For many alien leaders, this silence felt dangerous. They whispered to each other, "Why are the humans not speaking? Why are they not striking?" Some thought Earth was planning something in secret, perhaps waiting for the right moment to unleash its forces. Others thought it was a clever political game, designed to scare enemies through patience. And yet some few began to wonder if perhaps humanity was simply warning. In one meeting among alien envoys, a nervous voice broke the silence. What if they do not answer with war? What if they answer differently? The others looked at him as if he were a fool. But deep down, the thought stuck. Meanwhile, on Earth, debates inside government buildings were intense. Military officials laid out options: targeted strikes, blockades, demands for justice backed by fleets. Intelligence officers argued about who was responsible, whether it was a lone act or something greater. Diplomats urged patience, reminding everyone that the world was watching. But the people themselves, ordinary men and women, had already chosen their way of grieving. They wanted the diplomat's mission of peace to mean something, not vanish in anger. News reporters interviewed families, workers, teachers, and students. Again and again, the voices that came forward did not cry for blood. They asked for truth. They asked for unity. They asked for the diplomat's sacrifice to have meaning. If we answer with violence, one elderly woman said on live television, then his death will become just another reason for war. But if we answer with dignity, the stars will remember. Her words were replayed countless times, spreading not just on Earth but across human colonies. Yet, outside Earth, the galaxy's tension grew. Civilizations that had centuries of history with each other suddenly began looking at humans with renewed unease. Old alliances were tested. In some starports, human traders were quietly asked to leave, not because they were hated, but because the locals were afraid of being caught in the middle of something bigger. In other places, alien citizens protested against their own leaders, begging them not to provoke humanity. The strangest thing was the way fear and respect mixed together. Aliens could not decide whether to brace for destruction or to prepare for something entirely different. The uncertainty gnawed at them. In one remote system, a young alien officer wrote in his personal journal, "The humans frighten me, not because of their anger, but because of their silence. Their grief is heavy, but it is not blind. I do not know if they will choose war or peace. And perhaps that is what makes them dangerous." Back on Earth, the diplomat's family was kept away from cameras, shielded from the storm of media. But the people felt connected to them anyway. Millions sent messages of condolence, drawings, and poems. Across different languages, one phrase kept appearing: "We will not forget." The grief was no longer just private. It had become collective, a shared burden carried by an entire species. Children in schools wrote letters that were placed in time capsules, promising that future generations would remember his name. Soldiers in barracks stood silently for minutes at a time, honoring someone who had carried no weapon yet had served all of them. Scientists paused their work, artists painted his portrait, and farmers in the countryside lit small fires under the night sky. Looking up at the stars with quiet respect, the galaxy continued to watch, holding its breath. Weeks passed, and still Earth did not move in anger. No fleets left their docks. No threats were made. The silence stretched longer and longer, and the longer it lasted, the more unsettling it became for those beyond Earth. Some alien commentators, speaking in their own broadcasts, admitted something surprising. "Perhaps," one said, "the humans are not what we believed. Perhaps they are not only fighters of a death world. Perhaps they are more." Others dismissed this as naive, but the idea lingered, spreading quietly among ordinary alien citizens who were tired of wars and rivalries of their own. In truth, humanity itself did not yet know what it would do. Leaders still debated behind closed doors, struggling between fear, anger, and the voice of their people calling for dignity. The galaxy expected war, but what Earth was preparing slowly and carefully was something very different. The silence was not weakness. It was a choice. And when humanity finally spoke, the stars would understand why. When the silence had stretched for too long, the world expected a storm. Humanity's fleets remained still, yet the galaxy's eyes did not turn away. Every channel, every discussion, every whisper circled back to one question: what will Earth do? Then came the announcement. The leaders of Earth, standing not as separate nations but as a united council, spoke to their people and to the stars. Their message was carried on every frequency, translated into dozens of alien tongues so that no one could miss it. They did not declare war. They did not issue threats. Instead, they announced something the galaxy had never expected: a memorial. The diplomat would be honored not just on Earth, but across space. Every world, every colony, every station where humanity had set foot would hold a ceremony. And more than that, every other civilization was invited to join. Allies, rivals, and even those who had once been enemies were asked to come, not to discuss treaties, not to argue politics, but simply to mourn together. At first, the galaxy didn't know how to react. A memorial? For a diplomat killed in their own halls? Many thought it was a trick. Some leaders suspected this was a stage to shame them publicly. Others feared it was a trap, a way to gather enemies in one place. But ordinary citizens, both human and alien, felt something different. The message touched them. It was simple, human, and honest. We lost one of our own. He carried peace in his hands. His voice is gone, but his hope will not be buried. Join us, if you wish, not in anger, but in memory. On Earth, preparations began at once. Entire cities transformed. Streets were filled with candles, flowers, and murals painted overnight. Schools rehearsed songs. Artists shaped statues, and ordinary workers volunteered to build platforms and spaces where people could gather. Broadcast stations set up massive screens, promising to link every vigil and every gathering into one endless chain of remembrance. When the day arrived, the world seemed to hold its breath again. In one city, millions filled the central square, each holding a light in their hands. In another, people stood silently along riverbanks, releasing lanterns into the water that drifted toward the sea. On faraway colonies, settlers gathered beneath alien skies, holding up simple banners with the diplomat's face drawn in starlight colors. Even astronauts aboard stations floating above Earth paused their work and pressed their hands against the glass, looking down at the glowing planet below. The galaxy watched in disbelief. Instead of war fleets launching into the void, they saw children singing songs of peace. Instead of soldiers marching, they saw families holding each other, tears streaming down their faces. Instead of revenge, they saw remembrance. And then something happened that no one had predicted. The invitation, so unusual and so vulnerable, began to be accepted. At first, only a few alien representatives appeared, cautiously stepping into human gatherings. They expected suspicion, maybe even hostility. But what they received was warmth. In one city, a small group of aliens walked nervously through the crowds, only to be handed candles by human children who smiled up at them. On a distant colony, an alien choir joined a human one, their voices blending into a strange but beautiful harmony that was broadcast across the stars. Soon, more began to join. In alien cities far from Earth, ordinary citizens lit their own candles not because their governments told them to, but because they felt it was right. Images spread of alien families standing silently in their homes, watching human broadcasts with lights glowing in their hands. It was the first time in living memory that so many species shared a single act, not out of fear but out of shared grief. The leaders of some alien governments felt uneasy. They had expected war and had prepared speeches for condemnation or defiance. Instead, they now faced their own citizens asking, "Why can humans grieve with dignity but we cannot?" Some leaders tried to forbid participation, but images leaked anyway. Ordinary people gathering in secret to hold their own vigils for the fallen diplomat. The galaxy was confused, but also moved. The humans had turned pain into a bridge, and though not everyone crossed it, many stood staring at it with new respect. On Earth, the largest ceremony was held in the capital, where a massive gathering stretched farther than the eye could see. Families, soldiers, workers, and children all stood together, united by loss. Leaders did not stand above the people, but among them, holding candles of their own. No speeches of anger were given. Instead, stories of the diplomat's life were shared. His first mission, the way he had spoken to children, the jokes he had told on long journeys. His voice was played back through recordings, reminding everyone that he had lived not as a symbol, but as a person who believed in peace. When the final moment came, Earth fell into silence. For one full minute, no one spoke, no one moved. Billions stood still, holding their lights, their heads bowed. Even the oceans seemed to quiet, as if the world itself had paused in grief. And beyond Earth, in places humanity had never set foot, aliens too stood in silence. That minute stretched into eternity, and when it ended, nothing was the same. Foreign commentators admitted what they had never dared before. Humanity had chosen not the path of rage, but of remembrance. And in doing so, they had shaken the stars more than any weapon ever could. Some alien historians would later write that this was the turning point. Not the diplomat's death itself, but the choice that followed. A choice to answer violence with dignity, a choice to invite others into mourning instead of pushing them away, a choice to show that strength was not only measured in warships, but also in compassion. Back on Earth, ordinary people did not think of it in such grand terms. They only knew they had lost someone who represented their hopes. And they wanted his memory to be honored, not dirtied by anger. In the following days, alien visitors who had attended the vigils returned to their own worlds, carrying stories of what they had seen. They spoke of humans who cried openly yet still reached out to strangers. They spoke of children who handed them flowers instead of stones. They spoke of a world wounded yet unbroken. These stories spread faster than any official message, reaching markets, schools, and homes across countless systems. In quiet corners of the galaxy, ordinary alien citizens began to wonder. Perhaps humans were not the monsters of legend, nor the simple warriors of the death world. Perhaps they were something more complicated, something deeper. And perhaps in that depth there was a lesson worth learning. For now, the galaxy still waited to see what Earth would do next. But already the first cracks had formed in the old image of humanity. They had expected fire. Instead, they had been given light. And that light, fragile and trembling though it was, had begun to spread across the stars. The days after the memorial did not fade quietly. Something had shifted and the ripples began to spread far beyond Earth. What started as a human choice soon became a mirror for others. Across alien societies, ordinary people could not stop talking about what they had seen. Families replayed the broadcasts again and again. The silent candlelight crowds, the children singing, the single minute where billions stood still. It was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed before. At first, many alien governments tried to dismiss it. Their leaders called it human drama, or emotional display. They told their citizens it was nothing more than a performance. But people were not convinced. They had seen the grief, the tears, the trembling voices. They had seen human leaders stand shoulder to shoulder with ordinary citizens not above them. And for the first time, many aliens compared that image with their own governments, and did not like the difference. On one distant world, workers in factories stopped their machines for a full minute in silent tribute. Their government had forbidden them from participating, but they ignored the orders. Someone had painted the human diplomat's face on a wall near the main square, and people left flowers there, even if they had never met a human in their lives. On another planet, a group of students held their own vigil, holding up candles made from simple wax. They sent images of their gathering into the galaxy's networks, and within hours, millions had seen it. It was not only sympathy, it was reflection. People began asking questions that had long been buried under routine and fear. Why do we accept endless wars? Why do we never grieve for peace? If humans born from such a harsh world can respond to loss with dignity, what does that say about us? For some leaders, this was deeply unsettling. They had built their rule on fear and division. But suddenly, the example of Earth was spreading among their citizens, and no order or threat could completely stop it. Protests began in small numbers, first dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. People demanded that their leaders show the same dignity, the same compassion, the same willingness to put aside pride for the sake of peace. Back on Earth, humans watched these developments with a mix of surprise and hope. They had not planned to inspire revolutions or question other governments. Their focus had been only to honor the diplomat's legacy. But what was happening now was bigger than any plan. It was as if a single candle lit in grief had sparked fires of conscience across the stars. In human homes, people began receiving messages from alien strangers. Letters, recordings, and small artworks arrived through digital networks, expressing condolences and respect. A farmer on a colony world received a carved stone from an alien child, marked with a symbol for friendship. A teacher in a human city showed her students a video sent from across the galaxy, alien children standing together, holding handmade signs that said in shaky translations, "We remember with you." This connection was something new. Humans and aliens had traded goods, signed treaties, and shared technology before. But this was the first time they truly shared grief. And grief, unlike politics, was something that every species understood. Of course, not everyone accepted this change easily. In the shadows, there were voices that mocked the memorials, calling humans manipulators who used tragedy to gain sympathy. Some argued that the human silence was not compassion but strategy, a waiting game before revenge. Rumors spread like wildfire, each claiming a different truth. Yet the images of candles, songs, and silent crowds were stronger than the rumors. They were too raw, too real to be dismissed completely. Meanwhile, investigations into the diplomat's death continued. Intelligence reports whispered of lone actors, of motives not tied to entire governments. Slowly, it became clear that the killing was not the start of a grand conspiracy, but the desperate act of one individual. But this truth had not yet been shared openly. Humanity's leaders knew they had to be careful. If they announced it too soon, skeptics would call it a cover-up. If they delayed too long, the galaxy's tension could turn dangerous. So they chose patience once more. During this time, human families lived their daily lives with a strange mix of sorrow and pride. They had lost someone, but the world had seen their response. In markets, in schools, in quiet dinners, people spoke of the diplomat's dream as if it had become their own. He wanted peace, parents told their children. And if we keep carrying his hope, then he still lives. On alien worlds, something similar was happening. Citizens who had once viewed humans only with suspicion began to see them as something else. People who felt pain the same way they did, who cried for their dead, who reached out in compassion instead of striking with weapons. One alien elder, speaking to her community, said softly, "I once feared humans. I thought of them as dangerous, reckless, but now I see they carry their hearts openly. Perhaps they are not as different as we believed." Her words spread far beyond her village, repeated again and again until they became part of the larger conversation across her world. Slowly, even rival civilizations began to soften their stance. They did not say it openly, but their actions showed it. Restrictions against human travelers were quietly lifted. Old agreements once frozen began to move again. In diplomatic circles, the phrase "the human response" became something discussed with both confusion and respect. Back on Earth, ordinary citizens did not care about politics or treaties. For them, the change they saw mattered most. They saw that their grief had not been locked within their own borders. It had reached out and touched strangers they had never met, and in that touch there was a fragile kind of unity. The stars had expected fire. What they had seen instead was something harder to understand, but perhaps more powerful. Humanity had shown that strength could exist in restraint, that dignity could echo louder than rage, and that compassion could cross the emptiest distances. The ripples had not stopped. They were still spreading, carried by whispers, images, and memories. And though the galaxy still waited for answers about the diplomat's death, it already knew one truth. Humanity had changed something. They had shifted the story. The world that had once been feared as the home of survivors and warriors had revealed another side, one that was harder to fight against, harder to dismiss, and harder to forget. And the galaxy, for all its doubts and suspicions, could no longer look at Earth in the same way. The investigation into the diplomat's death reached its end slowly, step by step, until the truth could no longer be doubted. Reports confirmed what many had quietly suspected but had been afraid to say aloud. The attack had not been the work of a government, not the spark of a hidden war, not even the act of an enemy civilization. It was the act of one lone figure, a being driven by personal anger, isolated and desperate, with no wider plan. When the news was finally shared, humanity's leaders chose their words carefully. They did not shout in triumph, nor did they pour blame on an entire people. They told the galaxy the simple truth, that the diplomat had fallen to one individual's choice, and that choice did not represent the billions who had opened their doors to him. They reminded everyone that the mission of peace had been larger than one life, and larger even than one tragedy. Many aliens were stunned. They had braced themselves for accusations, for Earth to demand reparations or revenge. Instead, they heard calmness, restraint, and dignity. It was not weakness, it was clarity, and clarity was harder to argue against than fury. Across Earth, people listened to the broadcast with tears in their eyes. They had waited weeks, even months, for answers, and now they knew. The wound was still deep, but the knowledge that a war had been avoided gave them strength. Families embraced, relieved that their grief had not been twisted into violence. Children in schools wrote essays about peace, inspired by the words they had heard. The galaxy, however, was not only relieved, it was unsettled. For centuries, power had been defined by armies, weapons, and threats. Now humans had shown something different, something many species had not expected to see from them. They had shown that a choice for peace could be as powerful as a fleet of warships. That kind of strength frightened some and inspired others. On alien worlds, debates erupted. In some places, citizens demanded their governments learn from Earth's example. They asked why their leaders could not show the same restraint, the same dignity. In other places, leaders tried to twist the message, saying humanity had only acted this way to gain sympathy. But the images of the vigils, the silence, the shared grief were too powerful to erase. Ordinary people remembered what they had seen, and memory was not so easily rewritten. Slowly, the legacy of the fallen diplomat began to grow. His name was spoken not just on Earth but on alien lips as well. His face appeared in murals on distant worlds, painted by hands that had never met a human in person. His story became one told to children, how a man of peace had died and how his people had answered not with fire but with light. Back on Earth, his family was finally able to step into public again. They had stayed hidden during the storm, but now they stood before the world holding one another's hands. They did not speak of revenge. Instead, they thanked the people for carrying his memory. They said his dream had not died, because billions had chosen to keep it alive. Their words brought crowds to tears, for they spoke not as leaders or officials, but as grieving souls who had turned their pain into something larger than themselves. Years passed, and the story did not fade. Instead, it grew into something larger than even those who lived through it could have imagined. New treaties were signed, inspired by the memory of restraint. Old rivalries softened. Where once fleets had stood against each other in silence, now there were talks, exchanges, and shared projects. It did not mean war vanished. Conflict remained a part of the galaxy. But a seed had been planted, a reminder that there was another way. In schools across human colonies, children were taught about the Diplomat not just as a historical figure, but as a symbol of what humanity could be. His story became a lesson in resilience, dignity, and the power of choice. On alien worlds, the same story was whispered, sometimes carefully, sometimes boldly, until it became part of their own histories too. And still, the galaxy remembered how it had felt in those first days, the expectation of war, the fear of fleets, the silence that held everyone's breath, and then the surprise, the shock, the awe of seeing a people choose compassion over fury. That memory remained like a scar, but not a painful one. A scar that reminded the galaxy of its own vulnerability, and of humanity's capacity for something beyond survival. For humanity itself, the lesson was just as deep. They had been reminded that the world was watching them, judging them, fearing them, and in that moment of choice they had revealed their truest selves. They were not just fighters from a harsh world, not just survivors of endless struggle. They were also dreamers, mourners, builders of bridges, carriers of light. In quiet homes, families still lit candles every year on the day of his death. On colonies far away, settlers paused to look up at the stars and whisper his name. On alien worlds, people still told the story of how humans had surprised the stars, and in the heart of it all was the simple truth. One man had been taken too soon, but his death had not been meaningless. It had sparked something greater than war, something that even weapons could not destroy. His legacy was not built on power but on memory, compassion, and the courage to choose differently. The stars had watched and waited for rage. What they saw instead was humanity's strength in its most unexpected form. And for generations afterward, those words echoed again and again in council chambers, in homes, and in whispered prayers. Humanity answered loss not with rage but with hope.